My name is Máximo Torero. I am the Assistant Director General for Economic and Social Development Department of FAO, and I will be sharing the session of today. As it was mentioned by Mrs. Yamamoto, the topic that we are going to touch today is a pretty complex topic. It's the interrelationships between food safety, healthy diets, and trade. It's something where, if you look at the literature, we don't find too much evidence today. We find evidence in each of the topics individually, but not too much on the interrelationships. And it's crucial because the way the world is evolving. Today, we are moving to a world that is changing enormously in terms of access to food, instead of problems of undernourishment. FAO reported last year that the number is increasing, 821 million of people undernourished. A world in which we are facing multiple forms of malnutrition. Obesity is increasing substantially, and also anemia is increasing. So there are multiple burdens of malnutrition that are happening at the same time. But at the same time, we are having more access to food. We are having more access to calories around the world. That's why food prices are going down. And that's also because we have access to trade. And trade is opening borders, allowing food to move from one location to the other, which is good for food safety and nutrition because it assures stability, assures access to different types of food and variety of food. But we have a huge problem also, which is the problem of food safety. And in the previous session, you have seen what is the level of burdens that we face because of food safety issues. So how we can create these interlinkages, how we can assess them together, given the drivers that we are facing today, urbanization, significant growth in certain economies, slowdowns in others, lack of regulatory systems in place, not clarity in terms of what is the policies that we should implement today to resolve problems of obesity, for example. There is a lot of policies that are being tried at countries, but very little solid evidence of what works, what doesn't work. There is also little evidence on how we can link trade to food safety. What are the things that we need to incorporate in trade policies to assure that we are able to move food which have the standards that we require to minimize any potential issue of food safety. And together with this is the issue of informal trade also, which doesn't comply through traditional mechanisms. So the session today tries to bring all these topics together, and we would like your help in trying to create interlinkages. So I hope through your questions, you will help us to interlink the three presentations that will happen and the way we will move forward. What we are aiming is on looking to evidence of policies that could help us to understand these interlinkages, because there is no way we will achieve reduction of undernourishment, reduction of obesity, improvement of anemia, if we don't have trade in place and if we don't have food safety in place. It's very simple in terms of undernourishment. If I have problems of food safety, if I have problems of diarrhea, for example, and all the sickness that were before, anything I do in terms of micronutrients to people that are facing these problems will immediately be destroyed. So we need to avoid those problems because they complement. We need to have policies that complement each other to minimize those potential risks. So we are very lucky today to have three presenters. Mr. Mario Masoshi, which will be looking at the effectiveness of policies targeted to promoting healthier diets. So he will focus on policies on healthy diets. Then Mr. Erik Wikström will talk about the critical issues on food safety and healthy diets at the International Trade Fora, especially looking at the WTO technical barriers of trade and trying to see how we can link trade to food safety to minimize those potential risks. And finally, we will go to a country experience where we have Mrs. Angela Parry-Hanson Canudo, which will align national food safety policies to promote food security and nutrition for the case of Ghana. So what are the main objectives of this event? We have three main objectives. First is to raise the awareness that food safety is important, but not sufficient to ensure healthy diets. Second, and most importantly, to discuss interlinkages between food safety, healthy diets, and trade. And lastly, to provide a forum to debate and identify options and possible measures that will help in promoting safe and healthy diets. And it will be central, your questions, to create those linkages. That's what we want to aim here so that we can move tomorrow and later in the afternoon to more in-depth analysis of this interrelationship between food safety, healthy diets, and trade. So we will have three presenters. Each of them will have 10 minutes to present their topic, and then we will move to questions and answers from you and also from the panel. So let me first start with Mr. Mario Masoshi. Mr. Mario Masoshi is professor in economic statistics at the University of Bologna. He is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Food Policy. He's a member of the scientific board of the Joint Program Initiative, A Healthy Diet for a Healthy Life, and a former member of the EC expert group on the evaluation of the EU school fruit scheme. He also worked as a consultant for FAO on nutrition policies. He has led research teams of the University of Bologna in several international research projects on policy evaluation, including the Current Policy Evaluation Network. He has published 2 books with Oxford University Press and with the Sage publication and several journal articles. So welcome, Mr. Masorchi. You have 10 minutes, please.
Thank you. First of all, I'm grateful to FAO, WHO, and of course WTO for the opportunity of talking to this distinguished audience. As a statistician by training, when I was asked to talk about these topics, I hope I would have, I think I can't see the whole screen, but I hope I would have more quantitative evidence to bring, because I don't believe that numbers can give you answers, but can help thinking about what matters. So in my presentation, I will first talk about what we know about what works in healthy eating policies, trying to make some links to food safety and trade, and cover especially 3 policy options that are especially relevant in this area, and at least for 2 of them, labeling and nutrient standards, the link with food safety policy is very, very strong. I will also think about trade, food safety, and healthy eating, although, as I said, from a quantitative perspective, it's hard to bring much evidence. Okay, let's see if it works. Yeah, it works. Okay, so the challenge is, how do we know what works? Well, first challenge is we mainly work on the effectiveness of policies, but we have mostly to settle for intermediate outcome. With food safety and food poisoning, maybe the link is easier, not that much, but a bit easier. With nutrition policies, where the health outcomes develop over time, it's much harder. So most of the evidence is related to intermediate outcome, to the healthiness of diet, rather than the health outcomes. The other problem is that, well, in science, we are used to believe randomized settings, but this is not easy for policies. And there are some exceptions, but mostly we work with secondary data. So after the policy has been implemented, this means that there are noises. This means that the data are not ideal, and it's not easy to isolate the impact of the policy from other factors that affect these outcomes. And this is something I really feel it's something important, that there is a lot of conflict and trade-offs between the time frame of evaluations and the identification of causal effects as they develop over time. Just to give a very quick overview, this is a study we did with FAO in at the end of 2017, and just identifies studies that have been conducted to evaluate ex post policies using, let's say, rigorous counterfactual estimations, statistical estimations. You can see a classification of the policies. I would like to point out a couple of things. Well, first, look at nutrition educations. It's really, there is nothing, almost nothing about the potential effects of good nutrition education in schools. Most of these policies, evaluation, by the way, are relative to high-income countries where data are easier to collect. And this one question I'm raising right now is whether this lack of evidence or this incomplete evidence is biasing policy adoption. Going to the last column, which is the strength of the evidence, we have quite a lot of studies suggesting evidence. A few about strong evidence, like, for instance, public information campaign, which are widely adopted, especially because they are less conflictual in terms of interfering with the markets. They do work, although the effects are usually relatively small in terms of potential health outcomes. So we need to know more. Starting with labeling, which has a strong relation with food safety, there is definitely high adoption. The approaches are very heterogeneous, and we have also an history of, since the labeling affects trade to a large extent, there are also trade conflicts arising from nutrition labeling, for example, in Europe. This is probably the area which is most investigated. And there are a lot of studies, mostly on experiments, but there are also ex post evaluation. There is, the body of evidence suggests small but important effects on specific nutrient intakes, much less on whether consumers change their behavior because of labeling. The increasing evidence, and this is common to other policies, about the industry and the food system reformulating the contents of the products. And this is very important, and we need more evidence on that. And the other thing which is common to the policy I'm discussing today is that we know what is affected by the policy, the specific food or nutrient. We know much less about how people substitute once they reduce the consumption of one food, one drink, or one nutrient. So again, more evidence is needed. This is one very, topical discussion, scientific discussion about taxes, which are increasingly adopted in many states. Like 5 years ago, there were few evaluation about that, but now there is an exponential rise in adoption, more on sugar than fats, just because implementation is probably easier. There is transmission to price, so those taxes actually raise price for consumers with a lot of potential problems in terms of equity, of course. Still, firm strategic behavior exists, so transmission is not straightforward. There is good evidence that there is a reduction in consumption, but the level of those taxes is small, so even consumption response is small, and it's really hard to identify large health gains out of those policies, especially because of the long-term perspective. Again, substitution are crucial. Substitution are not the same for all consumers. They might be heterogeneous, and so it's important to know more. Not only introduction of those fiscal measures, even the discussion about those fiscal measures induce reformulation by firms by reducing the targeted nutrients, for example. And lastly, but not least, whenever there is a debate or introduction of a tax, there is also a sort of information campaign, so these taxes are signaling a potential health risk to consumers. It's interesting that in the US, the introduction of those taxes has been linked to polls, electoral polls, and so the information becomes even stronger. So it's possible that the price-induced effect is not the main one when these measures are discussed. And of course, I don't need to emphasize the relevance for trade if if these measures are considered. Last, nutrient standards and reformulation. Restrictions on contents is not as common as for food safety policies, but there are several voluntary agreements. It's hard to isolate how much they lead to reformulation again, but there is evidence that when they are clearly targeted, they do improve diets, especially when they're binding to food producers. They have high potential, especially in combination with other policy measures. Labeling and taxation are two examples, and again, this is one of the conclusions that we raised later, is more than one policy at the same time might enhance the effects. Okay, this is the slide that brings less evidence, but we all know that trade is really crucial to healthy eating. It might affect prices, just like fiscal measures, availability of healthy foods, and also the composition of foods, of available foods, so it's definitely one of the key elements. it's a very big governance challenge to balance the nutrition elements, the trade effects, and the food safety issue. I think we need more robust evidence in this area, and we have to start by recognizing how important are the interrelation, and this session is just a demonstration of that. Finally, just a few final considerations. So we do have a growing body of evidence on health eating policies, but we don't know enough about how much those policies generate substitution across consumers, how they substitute the targeted foods, how they improve their diets, the overall diet. We don't know enough about how much the food systems reformulate, and how to maximize the health outcomes. Too often we stop at the intermediate outcomes, diets, but not the health. And finally, and this is, I think, it's very important and a big challenge for scholars studying the effectiveness of policies, several policies happening at the same time. This is also important when balancing food safety policy, food nutrition policy, and trade policies. The other element I already mentioned is that we struggle to provide long-term evaluation on long-term outcomes. And I wonder, the education was a good example, whether the lack of evidence of how much the diet of a child can improve if it's well educated in primary school years, for example, has generated a bias in adoption. So there are less common, nutrition education programs are less common than one would expect. Okay, finally, health eating policy, of course, by themselves have major trade implications. Just think about fiscal measures, food standards, nutrient standards. And the other way around, trade policies do generate different availability. This is an area where hopefully more data will become available and there will be more evidence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario. So clearly, the importance and the commitment towards improving healthy diets is central, and especially to minimize the risk of multiple burdens of malnutrition. But as you mentioned, although we have information on nutrition labeling, information on market policies, and also on food taxes, still we have a lot of gaps in terms of evidence, solid evidence that will allow us to come up with solid recommendations to countries to implement. And that's something that our role is to keep improving and keep bringing those evidence up front. But at the same time, we have the issue of a good thing, which is access to goods through trade. But as in any cases, when we move from autarky to market economies and to open economies, good things can happen, but also problematic things can happen, because now goods can flow from one location to the other. And that's where we need to understand what is going on and how trade policies are being looking at the issue of healthy diets, but also the issues of food safety, which is crucial. Just to give you an example, if I export a raw potato from a country like Peru to another reality with other types of soils and defenses, I could create a huge problem of healthy issues in terms of the production of potato in those areas, because they are not ready for the different pathogens that potato will bring. So how we can learn from what is happening, and what is the level of discussion that are happening in trade today. So for that, we have Mr. Erik Wikström from WTO. Erik Wikström joined the WTO in 1995. He has a broad experience from several areas of trade policy relating to standards and regulations, including agriculture, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, trade and environments, as well as trade and health. He currently heads the team on technical barriers to trade, TBT, within the Trade and Environment Division. Mr. Wikström has a master's degree in the area of agriculture and economics from Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in Uppsala, Sweden. Please, Mr. Wikström.
Thank you very much. So I won't thank the WTO, since I work for the WTO, but let me thank both the WHO and FAO for the invitation to speak on this panel. So what I would like to do is speak a little bit about the issue of healthy diets, nutrition. So my background, as was just said, is the technical barriers to trade agreement. And in the WTO, you have this division between food safety, which is the SPS agreement, the Standards and Phytosanitary Agreements, which you are all very much aware of, and the TBT agreement on technical barriers to trade. Sometimes I find it easier to put a face on things, and you're lucky here because responsible for SPS at the WTO is Christiane, so you can put that face on it, and for TBT it's myself. So these areas are complementary, and both are related to health, but there's this distinction which is important to make between, on the one hand, SPS, which is more food safety, and on the other hand, and TBT. So I wanted to make basically 3 points in my intervention. The first one is to look a little bit at the role of trade. Why is trade an issue with respect to nutrition, healthy diets, in a way lifestyle choices? And also then, secondly, how does this come up? So why is the TBT committee at a crossroads here, in a sense? What are the types of issues that come up with respect to health and nutrition? And then thirdly, a comment on the rules, and because WTO is all about rules and the disciplines in this area. But I don't question, and I think it's very important to stress, and therefore our cooperation is important, that the burden in terms of health is very great. I think you mentioned the figure 11 million in terms of deaths annually. So there is no issue about the importance of this issue from a perspective of regulating or addressing this issue, whether it's different trade measures. So I come at this just simply as, in terms of trade, what are the issues that arise here at the WTO? So if we look at the role of trade to begin with, and I think this was already mentioned by the two ADGs here when they started, of course, at a very, very broad level, trade is seen as an engine for economic growth and poverty reduction. This we have seen within the Agenda 2030, the SDGs. And I think the words in red there are important. It's one engine. You need many engines, but trade is one engine for economic growth and development. And as countries grow, as incomes go up, of course, people have more resources to spend on food and hopefully on healthy foods. You mentioned a potato. At least that's a vegetable, but if countries more and more import chocolates or fatty foods or food with too much salt or sugar, you have another outcome. And we are all consumers, and we choose what we buy. So it's a lot depends on what the choice is and what governments can do to affect that choice. So in a way, to me, there is a but here, and that is that, in a way, trade should not be the primary focus with respect to these issues. I mean, after all, if we are talking about a focus on nutrition, on health and diets, the focus should be on what is the most effective health policy to address the types of challenges you have been discussing, whether it's food safety or nutrition, obesity, malnutrition. So the focus has to be there. You cannot start with a focus on the trade side of it. So the trade policy, yes, one needs to take it into consideration, but I think the target should be always to look at what is the most effective way to achieve a particular health policy. And there, that is always going to be a mix of instruments, between incentives or disincentives that countries use to achieve health policy. And they can be about awareness raising, they can be about incentives, subsidies, they could be about taxes, it could be about prices. But one large element that we heard that was mentioned just now is regulation. And within regulation, there is a lot of focus on labeling. And labeling is often the type of issue we see here at the WTO. So I use these a little bit as an example. So that was my first point, to try to see, one has to see a little bit trade in terms of the perspective. And I think it's important to look at health policy to begin with, and then it should be show that you try to achieve the best health policy outcome, taking into consideration trade rules. The second point is more practical. So how does this type of issue come up at the WTO? And now I'm using the example of diet, of nutrition, of obesity-related concerns and labeling. They tend to come up in terms of what we call specific trade concerns. So that's not a dispute, but that's when a country comes to the WTO to complain about a measure that they think has an undue effect on trade. It might, they may or may not be right, and there's often a debate, but it's not a legal dispute. It's often about a measure that has not even gone into force yet. So it's preemptive in a sense. It's a preemptive discussion of these types of issues. And in these discussions, the TBT committee lately has been quite a bit in the crossroads because there's a lot of debate that has to do with non-communicable diseases. So not the typical food safety we heard about earlier this morning, but things related to tobacco, to alcohol, obesity, nutrition, diet, healthy lifestyles, etc. So if you look a little bit at the numbers to get a broader look at this, if you think first of products, because it's actually quite complex. There have been 581 STCs in total, so 581 trade concerns brought to the TBT committee since 1995. About 20% of these are related to food. So food is very much at the center, or a very important part of the TBT committee's work. About another 12% are related to beverages and 4% tobacco. And the rest is everything else, because the TBT also covers railways, aircrafts, mobile phones, shoes, textiles, energy efficiency. The agreement covers all products. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that if you look at food and beverages, actually the number of issues that are brought to the committee because there is a concern are quite substantial. There's a quite big amount of that. Of course, not all of that is related to nutrition. That's an important point to make. Here, this slide only looks at the products. So if we wanted to look at the types of measures that are raised, then it's better to have some way to focus on this, to look at labeling. If you look at all the measures brought to the TBT committee, about a quarter are related to labeling, so 136 trade issues that have been brought to the committee. Within those, 48 are related to non-communicable diseases. And the rest is other issues like energy efficiency, GMOs in food, definitions of what the food is, characterizations of the food products, sustainability, organic production, also related to food, but not necessarily related to nutrition labeling, healthy diets in that sense. But if we took a closer look at those 48 in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see then that, if we take away tobacco for now, then if you look at the types of issues that are related directly to food and beverages are a big part of the concerns that come up in the TBT committee. And then if you try to dissect these issues more closely, and I hope I haven't lost you with all the numbers here, but the type of issues that arise have to do with, for instance, graphic warning on alcohol. They can be about general information to consumers about foods, processed foods, measures that are about promotion of healthy eating among children and adolescents, and quite a bit about measures that are about sugar, fat, and salt, or even energy drinks and caffeine. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on the health issues, so I'm not sure that would come under the NCDs. There's been measures about snack foods and how to prevent them, and lots of discussion on infant formula. So these are the examples of the types of issues. One, to be more specific, one that took quite a lot of attention of the committee was a rather innovative measure by Chile that was notified in 2013 about food labeling. And this was an interesting one, and in the discussion we could talk more, but it is one that brought out all the tensions that you will see in the typical TBT committee meeting. The tensions between, at home, the domestic industry in terms of the trade, those who are promoting the trade interests, and those who are in the health ministries, and how they might struggle. What do the multinational companies say about this, and their position is different, and what do other governments say when this issue comes up in the committee. But one thing that's important to remember here is that no one ever disputes the importance of the health objective that Chile had in terms of trying to avoid what they called was an epidemic of obesity. No one disputed that, but it was how you got there in a way that was the least trade restrictive and that didn't cause too many problems with trades. So third point, final, the comment. Very briefly, I would only mention that one should remember the preamble of both the TBT and SPS agreement, but now I'm thinking mainly of the TBT, which talks about the fact that no country should be prevented from taking measures that are about protecting human life and health. So that colors the whole agreement that falls after it. That is a very important chapeau in terms of, in SPS, you would talk more of setting the appropriate level of protection. So that gives a lot of deference to countries in terms of their right to protect health. Instead, these agreements, they bite, so to speak. They become difficult, so to speak, with respect to their implementation, that you cannot do so in a discriminatory manner, the way you implement the measure. You have to be transparent. You should be using international standards. This is where the agreements have a stronger impact. But I would say that being non-discriminatory, being transparent, using international standards in no way encumbers the ultimate objective of protecting health. That's the main message to give. And in fact, if you look at some of the disputes in this area, no one has been found so far, but the lawyers in the room will correct me if I'm wrong, has been found to be creating a measure that is unnecessarily trade restrictive when it has been trying to achieve a health objective. It has been more about these issues of discrimination, perhaps transparency, the use of international standards. And there's a lot between the lines that has been done by the committee in terms of good regulatory practices that can make the development of a measure less trade restrictive, non-discriminatory, etc. And that I think the committees in the WTO, both the TBT and SPS, have things that can be learned from. Finally, the last point is that I think the work of the committees, both SPS and TBT, so SPS on food safety, TBT on lifestyle, health, diet, nutrition, alcohol, tobacco, I think they have an important preempting function. You know, the fact that you can discuss many of these issues before they become law, before they go into force. That avoids dispute later on down the road, and it also enables cooperation between trade and health people at a very early stage, because that cooperation is extremely important to make sure that you actually achieve the health objectives with little trade disruption as possible. Also, I think these committees are an important way of signaling where there is an absence of international standards, for instance. There is a lot of debate on nutrition which signal to the Codex, where I think a lot of work is going on with respect to standard setting for front-of-pack labeling, etc. So those were my 3 points. The fact that I think one should not focus on trade policy, it should be health policy up front, that in the TBT committee there is a lot of discussion on NCDs, so nutrition is very much at the forefront. In a way, it's at a crossroads. And I think if you look at the rules, there is plenty of policy space to regulate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think you bring something pretty important, especially the concept that this could be a mechanism for signaling and preempting for policies that countries are being implemented, because the last thing you want is that policies that are being implemented to optimize health issues will be trade restrictive. So you want to keep the possibility of the goods to flow to be able to assure food security and nutrition. So now the idea is to bring this to a country example. Chile has been mentioned. There has been a lot of documents coming out as a result of the Chile policy that Chile implemented, especially to reduce consumption of fatty foods and sugars. But we want to bring the example of Ghana. And Mrs. Angela Parry-Hanson Cunado will align national policies for food safety policies to promote food security and nutrition. Mrs. Cunado has both a master and a PhD in food science from University of Pretoria, South Africa, and a bachelor's in cell biotechnology from University of Alberta, Canada. She's passionate about food safety. Her research interest is in the food microbiology, particular application of food safety systems to control bacterial pathogens in foods, microbial adaptation in food and food environments, antimicrobial resistance, and microbiological risk assessments. She's an African woman in the Agricultural Research and Development Fellow, the first Vice Ghanaian woman in Agricultural Research and Development, and a Cambridge Africa Research Excellence Fellow. So welcome, Mrs. Cunado, and you have the microphone.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I would like to appreciate FAO, WHO, and WTO for this opportunity. Here's an my presentation on the outline. I'll give a brief introduction, talk about Ghana as a case study, present some of the food safety and nutrition issues we experience, touch on our national food safety policy, give some recommendations, and conclude. Food security talks about physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Now, food safety and nutrition are critical components of that definition, and they need to be addressed simultaneously alongside the 4 pillars of food security, being food availability, food access, food utilization, and the stability of these. Unsafe foods will directly weaken utilization as foodborne diseases result in complex physiological processes that result in nutrient loss, malabsorption, poor appetite, and it can weaken immunity to other illnesses. Now, poor agricultural practices, poor handling practices, and poor storage facilities also result in reduced availability to safe foods and also reduces access to alternative staples that are also safe for consumption. Now let's look at Ghana as an example. Ghana is a lower middle income country located in West Africa. Ghana has achieved high economic growth and transformation in the last 2 decades. We achieved substantial improvements in food security by reducing poverty and extreme poverty and reducing chronic and acute child undernutrition. However, 1.2 million Ghanaians are food insecure and another 2 million Ghanaians vulnerable to food insecurity. Micronutrient deficiency, especially to anemia and child undernutrition, is still unacceptably high in Ghana. And there are large discrepancies between food security among rural and urban populations. The malpractices that introduce microbiological and chemical hazards into Ghana's food supply include the following: illegal gold mining that make use of mercury that end up polluting arable land and water bodies and also end up in our food. We have huge problems with hygiene and sanitation that introduces enteric pathogens such as Vibrio cholera, typhoidal and non-typhoidal salmonella, pathogenic E. coli, Shigella, Clostridium perfringens, and infections such as rotavirus and cryptosporidium that enter our food and cause all sorts of infections. We have banned substances such as DDT that is illegally added to salted and fermented fish in the informal sector. Sudan red dye, which is also a carcinogen that's added to palm oil to increase the color intensity that consumers want. Parathion that has been found in imported tomatoes and mangoes from the formal sector, and other toxicants such as lead we find in commercially milled products in the informal sector, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons we find in hot smoked fish that most Ghanaians consume. Exposure to mycotoxins are also high, particularly aflatoxins, but also fumonisins and ochratoxins due to poor harvesting, drying, and storage systems. Ghana is in the middle of a diet transition period, and this is because of economic growth and increase in urbanization. We see that the Ghanaian diet has increased in calorie content, but the content of proteins, good quality proteins, especially from animal sources, has not increased. Now, although child undernutrition has reduced substantially, because of this diet transition, we're experiencing a triple burden of malnutrition, being micronutrient deficiency to iron, iodine, and vitamin A among women of reproductive age and children under 5, undernutrition, especially in the form of stunting and wasting, that's still high, and overnutrition in the form of obesity and overweight among adults, especially women of reproductive age, some of whom are micronutrient deficient within the same household. All of these are resulting in increases in non-communicable diseases such as diabetes and stroke. On the other hand, we see better access to staples and increase in fortification, soya and peanut fortification of complementary foods, which is important to reduce malnutrition among children, but it's also increasing exposure to mycotoxins, which has effect on undernutrition. We also see an increased consumption of fruits and vegetables among urban populations, which is great, but there's also increased exposure to enteric pathogens and pesticide residues from these same sources. Because of increasing urbanization, there's high demand for processed foods, ready-to-eat foods, convenient foods, so we see an increase in street food vending operations and convenience foods sold in traffic, which does not respect the cold chain, and this is presenting all sorts of food safety hazards. Well, it's not all doom and gloom. We have a national food safety policy, which through the support of WHO was drafted. The process started about a decade ago, and it followed a comprehensive food safety situational analysis in Ghana. The policy, among other things, look at improving and enhancing coordination among food safety agencies to improve efficiency of food control, to improve compliance to international food safety standards and international trade, increase human technical capacity, especially for foodborne disease surveillance, which is largely lacking in Ghana, increase laboratory testing countrywide and regulatory enforcement. It's also looking at enhancing evidence-based interventions for sustainable improvements. For example, there's talk about making hazard analysis and critical control points, which at the moment is voluntary, to be compulsory within the food sector. One other problem that is a huge barrier to consumer education is the deep-seated food safety myths that is not advancing the cause of food safety. For example, there's a common notion that African gems don't kill. And there are notions such as wache. Wache is a rice and beans delicacy in Ghana. Sometimes you hear pronouncements on media, on radio, that the best waches are the ones sold by street food vendors by open gutters. And it has implications on consumer behavior, regardless of educational level. Now, the National Food Safety Policy, though it's a very good document, has few gaps. It's heartwarming to know that it's currently under review, supported by the FAO. So it is time to make the connections between food safety, dietary quality, and good nutrition. And we can do that through policy coherence and synergies with other national policies that touch on food safety. For example, we have the environmental sanitation policy. We have recent policies such as planting for food and jobs and one district, one factory. There should be linkages with these to enhance a healthy food environment. Also, the policy is silent on strategies to solve the golden trio, which is sanitation, access to safe water, and energy resources. We know that about 90% of foodborne infections is as a result of these. Without tackling these problems, there's no way we can win the war against food safety. So there needs to be clear strategies on how to improve these alongside food safety efforts. Now, one of the important barriers to progressive food safety is the lack of incentives for food safety system implementation. Studies have shown that consumer awareness of food safety is an important driver for decisions made by producers, processors, and consumers alike. Studies by Ragasa et al. And work that we've done at the university show that Ghanaian consumers are willing to pay more for safer foods. By empowering consumers to appreciate fundamental food safety concepts, to identify food safety non-conformance, and to demand safer foods will create the market incentives that will drive food safety system implementation in both the formal sector and the informal sector to enhance self-regulation. Also, our policy touches on risk analysis as a guidance principle, but there are no clear strategies for a risk analysis approach to food safety. The world is heading towards global harmonization of food safety, and yet as at now, we are not using risk analysis at all in our standardization and regulation. It is important that the policy makes clear strategies on building risk analysis capacity to be able to use this to generate enough data to support food safety efforts. In conclusion, foodborne hazards in Ghana are predominantly microbiological and chemical in nature, and Ghana's diet transition presents emerging public health threats from over and undernutrition and foodborne diseases. But these can be solved with active implementation of the National Food Safety Policy, which requires a review to address food safety holistically through a food security lens and explore the synergies with nutrition and related national policies. Once again, I would like to thank you, FAO, especially Professor Nalate, for this opportunity, and Kowandam and Nora Lisa from IFPRI Ghana, Kofi Esel and Edward Archer from Food and Drugs Authority Ghana for providing documents that I used for this presentation. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think that you brought a very important topic on the complexity of having a policy for food safety at the country level, and especially how complex it will be also to interrelate that with nutrition and other forms of malnutrition in the country. So it's not only just food safety issues, but what are the trade-offs with other forms of malnutrition that we need to take into account when looking into this topic. So now we want to open for questions and answers. So please, we will take rounds of 5 questions each, and then I will pass to the presenters to respond. Questions, please.
Shakib Sharifi from Afghanistan. We were part of the first conference in Addis Ababa, and we maintained that since trade is essential for food security, and you can't barricade countries in different isolated islands, so we have to trade. But in order to trade and be sure about food security and safety, we need to have a universal labeling system where the processed food has a clear labeling with also a dosage recommendations in terms of how much it would be safe to take of certain food. Would it not be possible to advocate a policy that would require a universal food labeling system which is easy to understand, which goes beyond just the ingredients and chemical names of the parts of that food, to the dosage recommendations that everyone can understand and everyone could stick to? Thank you.
Thank you. My question is to Dr. Angela Kunadu from Ghana, who basically referred to the problem of mercury poisoning, which is arising from polluted arable land and water bodies as a result of small-scale mining of gold. I was just wondering, I would like to find out from Dr. Kunadu in terms of a comprehensive strategy that we should have in Africa beyond Ghana because of other large mining countries like the Congo, like South Africa, and so on, and other countries, where are there problems of small-scale miners using chemicals such as mercury, but also cyanide and lead? Should there be a comprehensive dialogue between the food safety stakeholders and the mining companies around issues of poisoning of land and water bodies? Thank you.
Thank you. My question is to Dr. Kunandu. How much of an impact does political interference have in Ghana in terms of aligning national food safety policies to promote food security? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And I would like also to thank the presenters for the excellent presentation. My question directed to the last presenter who talked about food security, food safety, and so on. I want to make a question. What is the link we need to make between food security and food healthy diet? Because in many developing countries, particularly in low-income countries, food security is a big issue, and there seems to be a compromise between healthy diet and food security. So what is really the balance we need to strike between these two issues? Thank you, Chair.
Muchas gracias, señor moderador.
Thank you, Chair. Roma Betacour from Ecuador. I want to thank all the presenters and WHO for their invitation. My question is aimed at the good doctor from Ghana. So, in my country, we're also facing a challenge. We're changing our primary health system, and we want to promote shared responsibility. We want to include the industry, but also those who produce medicines, foods, consumers, importers, exporters, all stakeholders. And obviously we include consumers. However, in my country we don't have a great structure for consumer input. And we actually think that it wouldn't be the best thing to move forward with a incentive-based policy, because this would or could well discriminate those who live on the margins of society and can't pay for a certified, safer product, even though they do have the right to be able to access it. Maybe we could look at other incentives, and I was wondering what other incentives you're looking at, especially in Ghana. What incentives could be used for not only consumers, but also producers, and so that we're not only focused on a product of higher value. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is to Dr. Mario on policy. And I would like to find out if there's been any study on unintended effect of policies that borders on promoting healthy diet. You know, for example, when you have policies on fortification of food, food vehicles, and leading to increased consumption, maybe of sweeteners, of sugar. So has there been any study in that respect? What is the outcome? National policies on unintended effects of food. Thank you.
So the question to Eric is, in the TBC, what is the process? For example, the case of Chile, is just a signal, or is another action that is being implemented? What comes out? So with that, I go back to my panelists. So let me start with Mrs. Angela.
Thank you very much for all the questions. I'll start with the strategy to address small-scale mining. In Ghana, it became obvious that small-scale mining was destroying our land and water bodies. And for a long time, it was difficult to get government to act on it until it became visible. Lakes turned brown, and there was a public outcry, and government was then challenged to take action. And it's been a difficult road, but government banned small-scale mining throughout the country until they came out with clear policies on how to regulate that sector. So that is how Ghana tackled this issue. Small-scale mining has been banned for now, but we do hear of stories in the media every now and then of some illegal miners coming out of the dark to start working and take charge of mining areas that have initially been secured. On a continental level, of course, there needs to be high-level dialogue among our political leaders to come up with a consensus on how to solve this comprehensively across the continent. With regards to political interference between aligning food safety policy and food security, it's not very clear. It rather depends on leadership interest. I think one of the limiting factors in Ghana is the lack of data to really convince the politicians that food safety is important and they need to pay critical attention to it. And that data we don't have. We have fragmented data. There's a lot of data at the universities, at the research institutes, but then we are not collating it in a way that we can use it to make a strong case for food safety. For example, this food safety policy we have has now been forwarded from the Food and Drugs Authority, which was initially hosting it, to the Ministry of Health, and we're hoping that the Ministry of Health will push it forward. With regards to food security and healthy diets and the balance, that's a difficult one. I believe regulation should be key because food safety is a fundamental human right. Regardless of what kind of food you consume, that food should be safe. So choosing healthier options should not present any kind of food safety risk to the consumer. And that means that government needs to make a lot more effort to ensure safety, especially in the informal sector. If we take aflatoxins, for example, for the Food and Drugs Authority to register a product for the formal market, it checks for all of these, for cereal-based foods, for peanuts. They'll check for aflatoxin levels to be sure that it meets national standards. But a lot of our foods are in the informal sector, and there's evidence that the informal sector is relevant and will stay relevant in the long term. So we need to look at how to ensure safe foods in the informal sector. And finally, about consumer-driven food safety, I think that if consumers demand food safety, it will have a ripple effect. We know that consumers are willing to pay more, not just those who are rich. We've done work across socioeconomic groups, and even those who we consider poor are also willing to pay more for safer foods. What we haven't done is to conduct a study to find out how much more consumers are willing to pay for safer foods. So we need to look at that and strategize on how to drive food safety from a consumer demand perspective. Thank you.
Mario?
Yes, I first would like to briefly touch about the universal labeling question because I found it really interesting. And like in Europe, there have been efforts to harmonize, and harmonization was a key word in food safety policies. And but at the same time, it was very, very hard, and still there are conflicts about nutrition labeling in Europe among governments and country and stakeholders. So maybe this is more a question than a comment, but I'm curious about, I agree that it will be a very beneficial strategy, and I wonder whether the WTO might be one of the places where this can be promoted. So it's more a question than. About fortification policies, yes, we do have policies, especially in middle-income countries. There are some evaluation, not the ones I will list as the strong statistical one, but they're all very promising, especially when the target groups are like vulnerable groups like pregnant women or kids, infants. The idea is getting to food standards. And again, there is a difficulty in getting the right data, because sometimes we have the data about the product composition, but then we don't know how much they are consumed. Sometimes we have data about nutrient intakes, but they are not usually as good as we would like to. So again, there is this kind of link in the food system change between what is available on the market and what is actually chosen by consumers, and I think there is room to improve the evaluation of those fortification policies.
Thank you. Eric?
Thank you. So on the process issue and how it comes to WTO, very briefly, I mean, governments regulate all the time in this area, whether it's with respect to food safety or nutrition or healthy diets or labeling information to consumers. So the obligation they have is when they do regulate in a way that affects trade, they have to notify. And there's a notification that goes to the WTO, and I think together with SPS and Food Safety TBT, there are several thousands of notifications that are circulated to all members every year. But most of that doesn't raise any issues. But if a notification, for instance, the Chile labeling one, is of concern to another country that's exporting to that country because they're afraid it'll be too costly or so, then they can bring it to the TBT committee, or if it's food safety to the SPS committee, and it's raised as a trade concern. And at that point, there is a discussion that sometimes can be quite long, but during that discussion, the member that has taken the measure will often go back and make changes, etc., to adapt it to those concerns that have been vented in the committee. But anyway, go ahead often and implement the measure, but taking into account the positions that have been explained at the WTO. That's a positive story, and it has happened very often that way, and that's the way you avoid a dispute. If you don't have that positive story, there's always the option of going to dispute settlement.
Thank you very much. So let's continue with questions. There was one here. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I come from Sierra Leone. I am the CEO for the National Standards Bureau. We do conformity tests to ensure that the food is safe for both export and for the local market. Now, permit me to bring you back to this technology divide I mentioned earlier. The laboratory infrastructure needed for some of these tests are very expensive, especially for testing aflatoxins, for monitoring pesticides, for doing heavy metals. These are very expensive laboratory equipment. Now, our economy is based on SME and SMEs and NSMEs. Now, these people who work in these areas cannot afford the economic cost of this test. So the government has a plan, the minister here got the plan to boost local trade by asking us to reduce, and we accept to reduce the cost of this test. Now, there's a dilemma there. The sustainability of this test has to be taken into consideration. And what I want to also refer to is the last speaker who addressed that question talked about rapid test kits. These are not accepted by importers. When you want to export honey or cocoa or coffee, the exporter asks for accreditation certificates. If you don't produce it, they won't accept it. So these are some of the issues we deal with. I don't know whether Eric will try to address this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We had a question in the left.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Sebastian Hjelm. I work as the Food Safety Director of Finland. Finland is a country with very much safe food. We're probably among the top countries in the world, and it will come to as no surprise to anyone that our main concern nowadays is healthy diets and nutrition. And And I just wanted to take the floor here to heed a word of warning, because whether you know it or not, and whether your concerns are right now with pathogens in food. I come from that area. I will tell you that and as most of you will have seen, that healthy diets is becoming an increasing issue all over the world. We've just made a comparison on burden of disease in my country, and we came. They are, of course, rather rough calculations, and you can't get exact numbers, but our calculations show that something between the burden of disease is something like 10 to 20,000 higher when you look at healthy diets versus traditional food hazards. So with this, I just wanted to thank Professors Mazzocchi and Wikström for addressing these issues, and also wanted to say that I think it's very important that we as regulators take the front seat here in this campaign, because it's notoriously very difficult to give incentives for people to eat healthily. So even more than with traditional food safety, we really have to make sure that we have government policies in place. And of course, we hope that the TBT committee and Eric and his crew will not stand in the way of national policies when they are tried out, because eventually we will have to have policies that actually work. And without trying them out nationally or regionally, we will not know what will work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm from India, from Food Safety Standards Authority of India. I just have one question. When we talk of healthy diets, the focus is, we are primarily focusing on packaged products, that is the pre-packaged products, when you're talking of labeling and taxes, etc. But in our country, and I'm sure in a number of other countries, there is a large informal sector of prepared foods which we are consuming every day. So would the regulation, when we talk of nutritional labeling, high fat, sugar, salt, how will it apply for products which we are consuming every day? So is it that maybe sharing of experience from other countries, or because we don't have any such policies from other countries, or we are not aware of that, how will you be able to regulate the prepared food sector, which is very important for nutrition? For food safety, yes, it is being done, but for nutrition, labeling and other things is, so we'd like to know from the speakers.
Thank you so much. Any other question? Yes?
Thank you very much for Mr. Chairman. I am from Bangladesh. I'm the chairman of the Bangladesh Food Safety Authority. You know, I have a question for all the panelists and in the stage. And you know, in our country, a lot of people in our country depends on the street foods, and the most of the food vendors are very small scale. We are talking about all the big industries and corporate houses who. And we are developing the policies and strategies for the big industries. But the poor people do have no option to go to the street food vendors and the small-scale food traders. And so we should think about, and this is a big concern for our country. And you know, in our country, most of the food business operators are small-scale and the street food vendors. So how we can improve the hygiene and sanitation and food safety issues for the poor people and the street food vendors and the small-scale traders to improve their food safety systems, and we think about the situation to improve. And I think global initiatives should be taken to improve this situation for the underdeveloped and developing countries like ours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one last question on top.
Hi, I'm An Yi, and I'm a master's student from Wageningen University. I have a question for Eric, and I was wondering what kind of evidences are generally welcomed and valued by WTO panels when they assess the effectiveness of a technical regulation related to health.
So we now will move back to the panel. I will ask my panelists to try to answer the questions and not duplicate, but also at the end to end with one phrase of conclusions for the session. So Eric, you're first.
So very, very quickly, I think on the point by the gentleman from Sierra Leone, from the standards body, I think you raised a very important issue, and that's the issue of infrastructure, and quality infrastructure, conformity assessment bodies, etc. And I think both from an export and an import point of view, this is very important, because if you are exporting products and there is no trust in the certificate your certification bodies have been issued because, for instance, it's not accredited, that means you're left out of the market. So this emphasis on quality infrastructure is only increasing. I see it in the TBT committee, and I think a lot of work has been done in the SPS area. You have the STDF, the Standard Strain Development Facility, that works a lot with laboratories, etc., specifically in the food safety, animal plant life health area. But we can come back to this. Maybe you can come back to me, because the emphasis on quality infrastructure is very important. From an import perspective, it's also important, because if you cannot certify, if you cannot test, you're more likely to ban, which means you have no trade anymore, to be on the safe side. So I think you raise a very important issue in the debate. On evidence, very, very quickly, I think there are no limits to the type of evidence one would look at. I wouldn't want to exclude any kind of evidence. There are probably lawyers would have said this in a different way, but I don't think I would put it differently. And on my final point, and also response to the gentleman from Finland, no, we will not stand in the way of efforts to promote healthy diets and lifestyle. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Mario?
About small producer and street food operators, I think this demonstrates how important is education. Labeling is useless if consumers are not able to understand label, use label. So again, in our research, we found that education, not only to consumers, but also to street food sellers, for example, might be very important instruments. And related to that, my conclusion is, like, for a while I worked with microbiologists on food safety policies, and they told me that it's very hard to look at the effects of multiple contaminants happening at the same time. And this is the same for policy mixes. It's hard to quantify the impact of policy mixes, but my understanding of what is happening right now is that when multiple policies are acting, there is this kind of signaling or information effects which improves behaviors. So I think this is probably the most interesting future for this kind of policies.
Thank you, Mario. Angela.
I would also emphasize consumer and stakeholder education. I believe that it holds the key to food safety improvement efforts. If consumers can understand the impact of food safety and how they can make food safety decisions every day, then there will be an inclusive drive towards food safety implementation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to all. Let me try to bring up some conclusions based on what we have been hearing today. So first, it's clear that we have a challenge. We have undernourishment going up. We have problems of multiple burdens of malnutrition. 88% of the countries face overlapping malnutrition problems and burdens, and that is not discriminatory, meaning it is affecting developing, poor, rich countries. And food safety is at the center of this. 1 in 10 people fall ill every year from eating unsafe food, and 420,000 dying as a result on low-income countries. So we need to do something, and the world is changing, and we need to find solutions to this. So today we have talked about what are the policies that are available. What we know is clear that we have significant knowledge gaps, but that is not an excuse not to act. We need to start to document quickly what works, what doesn't work, and learn where we can improve. Second, we know that trade is important for food security and nutrition. It provides access. But also, we understand that it's part of this game, it's part of this food system, and we need to find ways in which regulations in the trade policies could contribute and complement what we need to assure food safety and nutritious and quality diets. What we have been hearing about the WTO TBT committee, I think is extremely good, because it helps to better understand the instruments that they have in place, and especially to provide these signals and to minimize the potential risk of disputes because of the policies that countries could start to implement to minimize these burdens of bad quality diets and burdens of food safety. The same with the SPSS issues. So from there, it's not that they will block, as it was mentioned, country-level policies or regional-level policies, but I think helps to harmonize the international trade mechanisms and to minimize potential probabilities of reducing trade, which is not what we are aiming to. It's on the contrary, we are aiming to have more availability of food and especially quality of diets. Interlinkages in these mechanisms in food safety, in quality of diets, in trade, I think are crucial. Potential mechanisms of international labeling or trying to work more with the Codex Alimentarius to include more elements on quality of diets, I think could be a mechanism to move forward. It's something that we need to work and something that we need to put more emphasis. But clearly, we need to work more together, all the agencies and all the stakeholders, because it's not only governments and international organizations, it's also private sector that we need to work together to develop the framework and the conventions that are necessary to keep this system in place. So let me just summarize by saying is that we have been talking a lot about food systems. And what it really means is that there are several elements that are interlinked. And in all those elements, there are trade-offs. And clearly, we can see trade-offs. We can see trade-offs if we restrict too much certain regulatory mechanisms, we can at the same time restrict trade, which not necessarily is good. So we need to assess those trade-offs, and we need to look at the different regions and where in the food systems we need to put more emphasis to resolve bottlenecks and problems, and to be able to keep this equilibrium, but with a major goal of having healthy diets and quality diets, better food safety, and to reduce the problems that we are facing today of multiple forms of malnutrition. So let's think carefully, and things won't be one rule for everything. It could vary the intensity of these trade-offs in the regions, in the different regions, but I think that's where we need to put more emphasis and to bring as much possible new evidence on these interlinkages so that we can resolve this problem, which is a challenge for all of us and something that we need to find ways to resolve as quickly as possible.